Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and today we will be talking about medieval romance. In particular, one medieval romance, Chrétien de Troyes, Yvain, the Knight with the Lion. I'm delighted to have as my special guest for this episode, Professor Larissa Kat Tracy. Kat is currently professor of medieval literature at Longwood University in Virginia. She's published extensively on medieval animal tales, comedy, romance, gender, and hagiography, but is probably best known for her work on medieval violence and cruelty. Her publications include a book, Torture and Brutality in Medieval Literature, and several edited collections with the squirm-inducing titles of Heads Will Roll, Decapitation in the Medieval and Early Modern Imagination, Castration and Culture in the Middle Ages, Flaying in the Pre-Modern World, Practice and Representation, Medieval and Early Modern Murder, and Treason, Medieval and Early Modern Adultery, Betrayal, and Shame. She's appeared in several documentaries for the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and National Geographic, and her work on medievalisms has been published by Salon.com, Business Insider, Elite Daily, Entertainment Weekly, The Wrap, and Women in the World for the New York Times. I'm hoping that Kat will return for future episodes on medieval torture and cruelty and adultery, but today we'll be talking about a more gentle medieval romance, the one that features a lascivious giant, demon brothers, unscrupulous knights preying on defenseless women, and a great deal of violence. This is Chrétien de Troyes, late 12th century romance, Yvain, the Knight with the Lion. A tale of love, or more accurately, several different types of love. The courtly love of a young knight for his wife, who also happens to be the widow of the knight he's just killed. The love of a lion for the knight who rescued him from a dragon. And the bromance between two brothers in arms. I hope you will join us. Hi, Kat. I can't tell you how pleased I am to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let me begin with what we know about Chrétien de Troyes, and we know very little about him, to be frank. From his name, we know that he was associated with the town of Troyes, which was the seat of the Count of Champagne and an important international trading center in the 12th century. And although the subject of Yvain is chivalry, courtliness, and love, Chrétien makes casual references, as we're going to see, to markets and textile commodity production. From his works, we know that Chrétien enjoyed the patronage of three of the wealthiest nobles of 12th century France, Henry the Liberal and his wife Marie, the Count and Countess of Champagne, and Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders. The dating of Chrétien's work is notoriously vague. A reference in Yvain to Nur ad-Din, the Seljuk governor of Mosul and Aleppo in Syria, suggests that the poem was written before his death in 1174. Chrétien began his poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which introduced Lancelot and the story of his adulterous affair with Guinevere into the Arthurian legend, by telling us that Countess Marie had not only ordered him to write it, but provided him with the poem's subject matter and meaning.
Right.
Because of this, it may be possible to date the composition of that poem to the period between 1179 and 1187, when Marie ruled Champagne during her husband's absence on crusade and their son's minority. Sometime later, Chrétien had moved to the court of Count Philip of Flanders, to whom he dedicated Perceval, or the Story of the Grail. Since Philip left for the crusade in 1190 and died on that crusade in 1191, Perceval must have been written in or before 1190. And since the poem is incomplete, it's often thought that that's the last poem that Chrétien wrote, and he wrote it in 1190. What is the historical context of this? Strangely enough, for talking about romance, it's a commercial revolution. the first industrial commercial revolution in European history. And that occurred in the second half of the 12th century. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time of poverty, dirt, filth, 1,000 years without a bath, and that's completely wrong.
Yes, it is completely wrong.
But your students probably think of that when they come in.
Absolutely. And they're stunned to find out that there are renaissances consistently throughout the Middle Ages, particularly in the 12th century.
And it's something that they don't realize, and I didn't realize until I started to study medieval history, that the High Middle Ages is a period of vigorous economic and cultural development.
Which is what allows for this literature and the literary development of Marie de Champagne's court, but also the court of her mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because without that economic flourishing and the thriving economies throughout France and England, none of this would have been possible.
It wouldn't have been. So this is what we, as historians, what we can say about this period. The population of Europe, excluding Russia, about which we know nothing, more than doubled, growing from about 30 million in the year 1000 to between 70 to 80 million by the year 1250. Demographic growth was supported by, and in turn supported, an expansion of food resources. If you can't eat, you're not going to have kids. So, European agricultural production increased markedly between around the year 900 to the year 1300, especially between 1050 and 1250. Most of the increase in grain production came from expanding acreage under cultivation, and there's little good evidence for a significant increase in the crop yield. The increase in arable acreage under cultivation was the result of both natural and human action. The natural action was this was a time when climate change was a good thing. Global warming was a good thing because you had a climatic optimum beginning around the year 950 and lasting until the middle of the 13th century. European climate became warmer, it became a little bit drier, and the result was a longer growing season, and that meant greater agricultural productivity. The most important element for the growth of agriculture was sodding, which is simply clearing forest land and bringing them under cultivation. The greatest period of deforestation in European history was the 12th and 13th century. By the end of the 13th century, you couldn't find a tree in northern France that was large enough to be a mast or to serve as the main beam for a cathedral. You couldn't find one. You had to go to Scandinavia for those. And this was a period also in which the Monty Python skit about the peasant living in the radical syndicalist commune with rotating executive actually was real, because you had free villages that were planted in this newly recovered land, because that's the only way you could have lords convince peasants to go live there.
And to do any work for them.
And to do any work for them is by giving them that freedom. Increased agricultural output not only translated into population growth, but it also meant surplus wealth that could be used for non-agricultural purposes. It could be used to fuel an industrial revolution.
Plus you have exploration, and you have a lot of contact with Eastern lands, and you have a lot of travel and exploration around the Mediterranean that brings in different goods, different textiles.
Notably silk, which is mentioned by Chrétien.
And trade.
Yes. Flanders becomes the center of this. Flanders and northern Italy, where you have textile industries that are blossoming. And these textile industries are both wool and silk. You have textiles being produced in Flanders. You have the merchants and the textile producers in northern Italy. But in order for them to communicate with one another and to exchange goods, they have to meet somewhere in between. And the place where they meet is the county of Champagne in France, because that is the natural route to go from Flanders down to, and by the way, Flanders is Belgium today.
Yes.
Go from Flanders down to northern Italy. The counts of Champagne, what they realize pretty quickly on is they have a gold mine in the making, because in order to have these markets, these giant markets, You need to be able to guarantee the safety of the merchants traveling. You need to have a place for them to meet. And the result of that is what's called the Fairs of Champagne. Chrétien's hometown was the site of one of those fairs. The Count of Champagne sponsored an annual cycle of 6 fairs held in the towns of Troyes, Provence, Logny, and Dacherobe. The counts are able to make their money from sales taxes and tolls on goods paid at toll houses along the routes to the fairs. Chrétien alludes to this in his poem Perceval, the Story of the Grail, in which Gawain, reluctant to engage in a tournament lest he be wounded before a trial by combat, is mocked by a group of women as a merchant dressed up as a knight in order to avoid paying the tolls. In return, the Count of Champagne guaranteed to the merchants protection and security. They also appointed fair wardens to enforce contracts. Similarly, the 12th and 13th century counts and countesses of Flanders became incredibly wealthy because of the taxes that they levied upon the textile producing cities and towns of that county.
Well, add to that the trade in wool coming from England, because the relationship between England and Flanders is very, very tight-knit. There is a lot of contact between England and Flanders, and particularly in the 12th century, when Henry II becomes king in 1155, you have that line from England into Flanders, but then also into Champagne and into the other territories that belong to Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry together.
And later, that's going to be one of the main reasons why we're going to have the 100 Years' War, is because England needs that connection with Flanders in order to sustain its wool industry.
Absolutely. And that's why there's so many close contacts between the Flemish and England up until the 14th century and into the 15th century. We have John of Gaunt, who of course was born in Ghent. And that tight connection also allows for these cultural contacts, this exchange of language, the exchange of literature, and to a certain extent, an exchange of laws, because Flanders is looking at English law in contrast to French law, particularly in the 12th century.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what may sound almost contradictory, but which really isn't, is that the growth of the Flemish textile industry, this commercial revolution, that all of this is going to be the fuel for the creation of the courtly society and chivalry, which requires surplus wealth. And the surplus wealth of the counts of Champagne and of Flanders are going to be turned into romances, chansons de geste, and into that culture of chivalry. What emerges in northern France and is going to be transported to England and Germany is
and
the
vice versa.
Is the courtly society. It's a society in which you have these great noble comital or royal courts, which are peopled not only by their household staff and their biological families, but by the familia, by their households. And their households include young knights from good families in the locality who have been sent to the great lord in order to be tutored in the martial skills of knighthood, horsemanship and the use of the proper weapons, the lance and the sword, but also the manners that are expected of a courteous, chivalrous knight.
And the sensibilities that come with that. And part of the culture that evolves in continental Europe, but also in England at this time, is a sense that a knight needs to be more than just a soldier. A knight needs to be more than a warrior who's good at arms. He has to not only have the manners, but he also needs to give honor and loyalty and courtesy to members of the court, particularly women.
Yes, and skills that you would never think about, because if you thought about them, you would say, oh, that's the Renaissance courtier. But the Renaissance courtier in the 12th century was the chivalrous knight.
Absolutely.
A knight was supposed to be able to sing. He was supposed to be able to dance. He was supposed to be able to compose poetry and music.
Yes.
Yes.
And he understands the necessity for operating within the court itself and operating in a castle environment that is not just warfare, arms, battles. It's also the game of love, or even just courteousness and elevated thought. The idea of composing poetry, if you want a popular culture reference, probably one of the best examples is A Knight's Tale.
Yes. Yeah. Which I love. It's a great movie.
I do too. I think it's wonderful. Movie. And I love it for all the reasons that it's such a medieval movie, because it's making fun of modern pretensions, but it also does all the things that a medieval romance does. It has anachronisms. It has a knight who has to compose poetry. It has feats of arms. It is a chanson de geste in and of itself.
And that really brings us to the troubadours in the south and the troubadours in the north, the professional poets and the professional performers, people like Chrétien de Troyes. Some of the troubadours and troubadours came from the aristocracy, but many came from this new urban middle class.
Yes.
They're educated. Some of them probably were clerics, like Andreas Capellanus.
Yes.
Andrew the chaplain, who was in the court of Marie.
And writes, of course, the satirical treatise on the art of love.
Yes, and it is really funny. If you understand what he's doing, it's really funny. Why don't you talk a little bit about medieval romance?
Well, the Arthurian culture that starts with in the middle 12th century with Geoffrey of Monmouth's invention of King Arthur from snippets of Welsh tradition really sets a model for this historical personage. And he's not historical at all, but when Geoffrey of Monmouth creates Arthur, that provides this idealistic king that can be transformed in so many different ways. And he's so popular that in the 1170s, Was does a translation into Anglo-Norman French for Eleanor of Aquitaine of that whole history. And
which
he involves,
brings it over to France.
Yes, it does. And when he infuses chivalry into the story of Arthur. It is Was who introduces the Round Table. It is Was who adds the dimensions of service to ladies. And that's at the insistence of his named patron, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And of course, Eleanor is corresponding back and forth with her daughter, Marie de Champagne, and they are sharing these ideas of romance, of knights who are going to be courteous, loyal, chaste when necessary, though not always. The 12th century is a little less concerned about that than later centuries. You have knights who are going to understand the need for community, and the community of knights, but also the community of ladies. And so the evolution of medieval romance comes out of those chronicles. And Chrétien de Troyes is one of the first to really give a full, complex picture of these competing values of the warrior who has to be good on the battlefield or tournament field, but also needs to be a faithful, loyal, dedicated servant to the women in his life, especially his wife.
Especially his wife.
Yes. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions about a lot of medieval romances, is because later romances focus on adultery, but Chrétien really starts with married love and knights who prove themselves. They win the heart of a lady, and then they win her lands.
Lots of land.
Lots and lots, huge tracts of lands. And those huge tracts of land are really important for these knights. And this culture of knighthood where you have all these young sons who need that financial base because they don't have it.
Exactly. We have to think of this from the viewpoint of the poet and the audience. They're not writing for us.
No.
The poet is not singing this for us. The poet is trying to entertain a group of young knights. These are landless knights at this point, or else they wouldn't be in the household. Some of them are going to inherit land. Some of them aren't going to inherit land, and they're looking to the Lord. They're really hoping that maybe the Lord will either give them some land and give them a fief, or better yet, arrange for them to marry an heiress and they will be able to get. So what you have is this fantasy in the romances of the young knight errant who goes out on his adventures and constantly encounters beautiful,
eligible
young women who also are heiresses, or they are already in possession of these great estates.
And if you think about the context of the Crusades as well, when you have women who've been widowed, whose husbands, like
Yes.
Marie de Champagne, whose husband went off on crusade and then he comes home and conveniently dies, leaving her a wealthy widow in control of a lot of land that she administered. And she has as her mother, she has as a model her mother, who was left land by her father. Eleanor of Aquitaine inherited her father's land in her own right. So when you have all of these women who have power, position, administrative control over their own lands, and they're widows, even better.
And there's a balance going on because the successful trouvère or troubadour has to be able to please his patron above all else.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise he's not going to have a gig.
And no one's going to pay him.
And nobody's going to pay him. But he has to please him at the same time that he's entertaining that household of young knights and some of the damsels in the court, and especially the lady. This is really important for this is his job to do this. And we know that Chrétien was good at it because we have all of those poems preserved.
Yes.
And he had two of the greatest patrons of his time who were paying him to produce those poems.
And he puts his name on it. This is an important point because a lot of medieval literature is anonymous. A lot of, particularly later medieval literature, is anonymous.
Yes.
But in the 12th century, particularly in the territories of France, they're putting their name to it. Chrétien de Troyes puts his name on it. He says, my patron gave me the subject matter, and I am simply doing what my patron told me to do.
Yes.
Which he was. And Marie de France, who was connected to the court of Henry II in England, even though she's of France, she's writing in England, in Anglo-Norman French, she says, I am Marie. I wrote this text. There's ownership, and you have male and female authors taking ownership of that literature.
Again, something that you think of as Renaissance, but not medieval.
Exactly.
And it really is 12th century that you have this. So we have this courtly society.
Yes.
And the courtly society, in some ways, think of these romances as didactic. They're not only wish fulfillment for the young knights, there's also education.
There's a model of behavior.
How should you behave? What is the right and what is the wrong thing? And there is no code of chivalry.
No.
There's a competition among poets who are trying to persuade that their version of courtliness
is the best. Yes. And I tell my students that frequently, that there is no one code of chivalry. You have knights who behave in a chivalrous manner, but what that actually means rather depends on who they're reading or who they're listening to or who's instructing them at that time.
You could say that every chivalrous knight has to be a good warrior.
Yes.
It has to be.
It's a given.
I mean, that's the sine qua non.
Yeah.
But after that, you say, yes, he has to be loyal, but loyal to whom? And then you have hierarchies of loyalty because they come into competition with one another. The romances are filled with those type of conundrums, those type of competing loyalties.
Absolutely. And what you see in a lot of medieval romances is a fantasy aspect to them, in a lot of cases magic or mystical events, but Chrétien's romances are actually very realistic.
The fantastic adventures of these knights errant are set within a realistic frame. In fact, it's sort of like horror film, or all of Stephen King's novels, which begin in the real world with name brands that you recognize, and this is life as you know it, and then that safe world dissolves into horror and fantasy.
Yes.
And then at the very end, maybe they come back
to reality.
Yeah. Chrétien's romances begin in a court which is supposed to be from the ancient days, from way, way back when people knew what love really was and what chivalry really was. But the reality is That's the court, that's the world that those young knights are living in. That's the world that Chrétien is living in.
Of course.
And then they go to Beaucélande, and Beaucélande is this forest where everything is magical.
Oh, because it's in Brittany. The Brocéliande forest is in Brittany, which is the other world.
Yeah, Brittany is a place of savagery and of fantasies and werewolves and everything.
All kinds of strange magical possibilities.
Yeah, it is.
And there's another dimension to that, particularly because Brocéliande is in Brittany. It's this Celtic other world that you get that infuses itself in Marie de France as well, because all of her lays are set in Brittany. And it's almost like plausible deniability. Oh, that happened in Brittany, therefore we can suspend disbelief a little bit about demons and giants.
Because
and
everybody
lions.
knows the Bretons, that's what they do. That's what they do.
Yes, and of course it's important that later Lancelot du Lac, is Breton in a lot of the English variations.
That's interesting.
Because when he goes to the Joyous Guard after snagging Guinevere in a much later tradition, that's in Brittany. And so, that whole contest of land. And of course, at this point in the 12th century, who owns Brittany? Henry II.
Or at least his son Geoffrey does.
So the romance of Yvain, the Knight with the Lion, starts as you would expect most Arthurian romances to start. It starts in the court of Arthur, and you have all the boys in the band. All the boys in the band are Gawain and Kay and these great knights. On this particular instance, though, you have the knights standing around outside. Arthur and Guinevere have retired for the afternoon from a feast. There's been a great feast, and rather surprisingly, they leave early. Now, Chrétien is fairly clear. They're shagging. They're going for an afternoon shag.
Yeah.
And afterwards, there's a bit of a nap, as you do. And while the king and queen are taking their delight and then snoozing, you have all the knights outside the chamber. Guinevere hears them talking, and she comes out and hears these knights discussing with Calogrenant his encounter with a magical, mystical marvel. And that's a big thing, is you've got to have this marvelous event or adventure. Now, Calogrenant doesn't want to talk about it, but Guinevere interjects.
Basically forces him.
Yeah, she does force him. And of course, Kay, who's a dick.
Kay is the dick.
Always. Kay is probably the nastiest, most malicious, snottiest, sarcastic, and Guinevere keeps calling him on it. And says, Kay, why are you even here? You have nothing good to say about anybody.
I love the introduction of Kay. Calogrenant becomes aware of the presence of Guinevere and leaps to his feet to show her honor. Chrétien then writes, and Kay, who was spiteful, wicked, sharp-tongued, and abusive, said to him, "By God, Calogrenant, I see how gallant and sharp you are, and of course I'm delighted that you're the most courteous among us, and I'm sure you think you are. You're so lacking in good sense. It's only natural my lady should believe you are more gallant and courteous than all of the rest of us. Perhaps it appears that it was out of laziness we neglected to rise, or because we didn't deign to do so. But by God, sir, that wasn't it. Rather, it was because we didn't see my lady until after you had risen."
She takes him to task for it and says, well, you don't have the courtesy
to do that. Guinevere takes Kay down. She says, "I do think you'd soon burst if you couldn't pour out the venom that fills you. You are tiresome and base to reproach your companions like this." And Kay has his position because he's the foster brother of Arthur, and he's the seneschal. We'll talk about being a seneschal
in a minute, yes.
Yeah.
But in this particular instance, Kay just starts with this malevolence. And we see Kay with this malice, and he's almost like Unferth and Beowulf.
Which is the reason why Calogrenant doesn't want to talk about this, because this is not an adventure that brings him glory and honor.
No, it is a shameful event.
Yeah.
And Guinevere forces him to do it, but because of his loyalty to Guinevere, and he does say, "You are forcing me to relate an adventure that I don't want to talk about. But okay, I will." And he talks about going to a clearing in the forest that has a well where the cold water boils, and there's a stone table, and there's this peasant. Hideous peasant. Giant who, it says his face is just awful, and he's got this huge head.
And he's herding bulls.
He's herding wild bulls. As you do. And Caligrant is told, oh, well, if you go to this well and you pour this water, there'll be a massive storm. And, you're going to have this whole event. And for some reason,
it seems like a good idea.
It seems like a good idea at the time. Caligrant thinks, all right, this hideous entity has told me about this marvel. I have to see it for myself.
Yeah.
So he goes, he pours the water, and sure enough, there is a huge storm that comes up. And out of a castle rides this unidentified, because they always are.
But we will later learn is Esclados.
Yes, who's Esclados the Red. And he is the guardian of this fountain in this garden, comes out of the local castle. But
why don't they just fence off this? I mean, this is a environmental hazard.
Well, you do also have to wonder if the peasant is just taking delight in sending all of these knights on these literal fool's errands. And the trial by combat that ensues, well, Caligrant gets pummeled.
He gets
his ass kicked, basically. And he ends up in shame, dishonored, having succeeded at nothing. And he doesn't want to relate this tale, but because Guinevere forces him to, and you have this instance where a knight's dishonor and disgrace becomes the cause of another event, where another adventure,
the adventure which is going to generate our story.
Yes, because Yvain, who's his cousin, feels so bad for Caligrant that he's been defeated. Yvain thinks, I have got to do this. I've got to avenge him. I've got to succeed. I've got to take on that knight.
Kay, who's always the consummate dick, responds to Yvain's declaration by saying, "It's clear that it's after dinner. There are more words in a pitcher full of wine than in a hogshead of beer. They say the drunken cat makes merry after dinner without ever stirring from his place. Everyone goes forth to kill the Sultan Nur-ed-Din." And then he adds sarcastically, "I beg you, whatever happens, don't go off without our leave. But should you have a bad dream this night, then you could stay here." Guinevere's response is, "Are you out of your mind, my Lord Kay? That tongue of yours never stops. Cursed be your tongue, for there's so much bitterness on it. Indeed, your tongue must hate you, since it speaks the worst it knows of everyone, no matter who they may be. May the tongue that never tires of slander be damned. The way your tongue behaves, it makes you hated everywhere. It couldn't betray you any more completely. I assure you, if it were mine, I'd accuse it of treason." I love that takedown.
But then the problem is Arthur hears this.
Yeah.
Arthur hears the end of this story. And Arthur decides, in his infinite wisdom,
we're all going to go, because this is too good not to go to.
And we have to go. And of course, Yvain, we get this wonderful moment of interiority, which is relatively unusual in medieval literature, to hear the internal thoughts of our knightly hero.
Yeah.
And Yvain's thinking, well, I don't want that to happen, because then I don't get the honor of killing this knight.
Because I'm not high enough up in the court. They're going to give it to Kay, or they're going to give it to Gawain, but I can't. They won't give it to me.
And I can't compete with that. And of course, nobody wants Kay to succeed at anything, but also Kay probably wouldn't, because he never does.
No, but Gawain would.
And Gawain in this text is so good. And he is the epitome of courtliness, honor, and chivalry.
Which I think shows that this text was written before Lancelot, the Knight of the Court.
Yes.
Because I don't think Lancelot exists at this point.
No.
So we should think of Gawain as the Lancelot perfect knight.
Well, and actually, because there's no Lancelot in the chronicle sources either. I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Gawain is Arthur's best knight.
Yes.
In Wasp, Gawain is Arthur's best knight. And in fact, Gawain is Gawain the Good. He's the Gawain of good counsel. He is always honorable and
he is
noble.
Courteous.
And humble.
Yes.
He is always willing to defer to other people. He's not arrogant. He is a complete mere opposite of Kay.
Yes.
And in this instance, Yvain just cannot imagine Kay having the chance to defeat this anonymous knight. But he also knows, well, Gawain would probably do it, and then I don't get that honor of avenging my kinsman.
And, for a young knight listening to this, they understand this perfectly well, and they understand that if Yvain is going to rise up in the court, he has to do something significant. This would increase his honor. And I think we should remind our listeners that what honor really means is the respect of the prud'homme, the respect of the worthy men.
And those who generally are going to pay you and are going to provide for your livelihood and your reputation. We get this in Marie de France's Lanval, when you have Lanval as a foreign knight who goes to Arthur's court, and he is worthy of honor, but Arthur doesn't give it to him. And he is impoverished by showing generosity to everyone else.
He has to.
But then Arthur never returns that generosity.
Yes. Fortunately for Lanval, he runs into a beautiful fairy queen who's in love with him, and she restores his fortunes and his honor. She tells him, the more you spend, the more gold and silver you will have, which allows Lanval to return to Arthur's court and to give lavish gifts. The perfect response to having been stiffed by Arthur.
And so Lanval is actually quite an indictment of that courtly system when it breaks down.
Yes.
And she's writing at the same time as Chrétien de Troyes, just in a different milieu.
Generosity is such an important virtue.
Absolutely.
And it's because the young knights and the troubadours, trouvères, depend upon it.
They do, and they rely on it. And it's also an instruction to the upper levels of society. You need to be generous to those who serve you well. You need to be generous to those knights. You need to be generous to your poets, to your troubadours, your jongleurs, to all of the people who basically provide the society in which you want to live.
The unromantic kings like Henry II find it disturbing that some of their children, particularly in the case of Henry II, his eldest surviving son, Henry,
the young king, yes.
That Henry the young king is open-handed, and all the troubadours love him, and all the knights love him, and he's spending so much money that Henry II is saying, come on, we got to get a hold of you. You're outspending your allowance.
Well, and then Henry blames Eleanor for her undue influence on him.
And William Marshall for his undue influence.
Exactly, and says, you all are creating this context for my son, to be so profligate and generous. And, of course, Eleanor and William Marshall understand that that's what you have to do. But in the context of this story, Yvain has all of these thoughts in his head, and he needs that opportunity. Not only is it the personal opportunity for vengeance to avenge a kinsman and what he sees as Calogrenant's shame, but it's also that possibility for preferment.
Yes.
It's that possibility for advancement. So while Arthur and the rest of the boys of the band, the rest of the court, are thinking and planning their own adventures.
Because you can't just do this casually.
No, you have to plan it.
But Yvain can.
Yes, and so he decides that he's got to get there first.
Yes.
So he goes off in secret, and he does this a lot. Yvain has a tendency to leave without telling anybody and sneaking off to make sure he can get something done before anyone notices.
Yes.
And in this particular case, he finds the horrible, nasty, ugly peasant herding his bulls.
Which answers the question, do knights errant ask directions?
He must, because I'm not sure how you would randomly be able to find this.
You see the alteration in ideals of masculinity?
That's right.
Yeah.
Because these knights know you have to ask directions.
Because they don't have any maps, and they don't have GPS.
And honestly, they were never going to get anywhere anyway.
Yeah.
And so the peasant is in the correct place.
Yeah.
And he's herding his bulls. And Yvain is like, okay, this is the first marker. He then finds the clearing. He then pours the water. And the storm comes up. Massive storm. What's intriguing,
trees come down,
and it's just like a hurricane.
Yeah.
But what's intriguing to me is the language of that exchange.
Yeah.
When Escalados comes out of the castle, and he accuses Yvain of treachery and of despoiling his clearing, and Yvain's like, well, it's not my fault. That's what happened.
Yes.
And there's a certain sense in this text, particularly, of knights being forced into situations that are really beyond their control and being accused of actual legal crimes that really are not crimes. And the battle that ensues is a vicious battle. And Chrétien describes the bloodshed. There is profusion of blood.
Yeah, there is no real distinction, as you've made this point when we were talking about this before, between the chansons de geste and the romances.
Absolutely.
They're both filled with violence.
They're filled with violence, and they're filled with violence that very often seems inconsequential at the time, which is one of the striking differences with Chrétien. Because a lot of violence is like, you think about the Chanson de Roland, you think of the Roland, where you have horses and knights cloven in half all the way down, and all of this blood, and of course it takes Roland 44 stanzas to die already. Takes him forever to die. And the sense of certain wounds really aren't that consequential. That may not kill them. I mean, Roland doesn't die from a sword stroke. His head explodes. Probably he strokes out because he blows his horn. In this text, the bloodshed is profuse. There is so much blood. But then Yvain delivers the killing blow. He fractures his skull. And Chrétien is specific. He doesn't just say, oh, there's tons of blood, which, you know, like in Chaucer, in The Knight's Tale, they're up to their ankles in blood, but nobody really seems wounded. Yeah. In this, the wound is mortal, but Chrétien describes it in detail, which suggests that he has some first-hand knowledge of these kind of wounds, because when he describes Yvain hitting Escalados on the head, crushing his helmet, brain matter coming out, it's a skull fracture. Now, Escalados can still make it back to his castle, and Yvain's concern is that this knight is going to die, and he's going to have no proof for Kay.
Exactly. What we're talking about is our virtuous hero, our chivalrous knight, is basically headhunting.
Yes.
Because he needs a trophy to prove, because Kay will never believe.
And it's Kay, specifically Kay, that Yvain feels he has got to provide evidence for.
And Chrétien is going to tell the audience this is not the proper behavior of a knight, and he does it in a really clever way. Because Yvain, as he's charging after the dying Escalados, Escalados makes it into the castle. Yvain almost makes it into the castle. He gets up to the portcullis, which is coming down.
Which is rigged.
And the portcullis comes down, slices his horse
in half,
and cuts off his spurs.
Yes. And what's interesting about that is during the whole combat between the two of them, Chrétien is very clear that the knights make sure that they do not harm their horses. And there's this whole point about do not harm the horses. That's dishonorable. That the correct chivalric warfare, you don't take out somebody's horse. You fight each other. And Chrétien repeats this point. So the fact that Yvain, in his pursuit, trips a trigger, because it is rigged. It is this mechanized trigger designed specifically to trip up anybody who might be in pursuit. The fact that it kills the horse that they've taken such pains not to hurt before is highly ironic.
And cutting off his spurs
is a mark of his knightly honor.
Yeah, he has been degraded.
He has. And he tumbles off astounded, because you might be if you weren't expecting that.
And he's caught. He's now stuck in the castle of the man he just killed.
And he is basically a captive. And what happens is he makes his way into the castle, and they are aware that he's gotten in. Somehow.
Because they're aware, because the corpse is starting to bleed.
But this is right after, at that point when the corpse starts to bleed. This is a really important point for medieval law. He has already gotten into the hall. He has already encountered Lynette, this maiden who says, I owe you a great debt.
I love it. She's in an upper chamber. The shutters open. Lynette looks down, recognizes Yvain,
and rushes to his aid.
Yeah, and because Lynette had visited Arthur's court, and she had been treated so rudely, probably by Kay.
Because he treats everybody rudely.
That the only ones who treated her with proper courtesy
and respect,
because she's a country damsel, are Gawain and especially Yvain.
And she remembers Yvain for that, and that becomes her driving motivation, though I would say arguably she's secretly in love with him, but that becomes her driving motivation for helping him. And at this moment, she tells him, I'm going to repay a debt. So hide on this bed. Here's a ring that if you turn the stone to the palm of your hand and lie in the bed, lie still, because no matter what, as long as you have the ring on your finger and in the palm of your hand, nobody will be able to see you.
It's wonderful to have the rings of invisibility.
Absolutely. And at this point, the funeral procession comes in with the corpse.
Yes.
And as soon as the corpse is brought into the hall, where apparently there are also all of these beds, which is a fascinating setup altogether, the corpse starts to bleed. Now, in certain medieval legal senses, now, I say legal senses because the idea that a murdered corpse would bleed in the presence of its murderer was a nice folk tale. It never actually happened. That's not how bodies work. It's not how blood works. And it's not actually in medieval law. There are some references to it obliquely, but mostly it's a romance fantasy that the corpse is going to bleed in the presence of its murderer. But that also raises another interesting point. The corpse starts to bleed, and they say the murderer must be here. But why is Yvain a murderer? He hasn't committed any kind of crime. He defends himself honorably. The whole combat is honorable. So what is the dishonor? Is it following him? Is it coming into the castle where they didn't expect it? Or is it just the simple fact that he won?
I think it's simple fact that he won, and that these are the loyal men of the dead lord.
Exactly. And so they see Yvain's actions as treason, and they're calling for the traitor and the murderer.
They are going crazy.
They are.
Because they know that the killer has to be here, but where is he?
And they're beating the beds, literally, looking for him, and he's lying very still, and apparently when you're invisible with this ring, they also can't feel you, because they don't.
Yeah.
And he manages to... more or less.
But he gets to see something now.
He does, because following the bier with the corpse is the most beautiful woman that Yvain has ever seen, the widow.
Now, the idea of love at first sight is the medieval romance trope. And it's always the men who fall in love at first sight. The women are a lot more practical about love than men are in medieval romances. For men, love is based upon sight. A man glimpses a beautiful woman and becomes insanely smitten. Yvain is enthralled by the sight of the beautiful grieving widow, whose name we will learn is Laudine. And Chrétien is very economical with names. He names her Laudine once, and that's it.
And then it's her lady or his lady. Yeah. And what's interesting is Lynette is named frequently throughout the text.
But not Laudine.
And Yvain is so struck by her grief, and she's rending her clothes, and she's crying in grief for her lost lord, and she insists that they find the murderer. She, too, is baying for Yvain's blood. And you get this kind of mob sense of mob vigilante justice and looking for Yvain. But Lynette decides that she's going to find a way to get the two of them together.
Which is amazing. I mean, okay, Lynette is obviously of noble blood, but she's also a servant of the Lady Laudine. And Yvain, instead of making good his escape,
hangs around.
He's hanging around because now he's captive. He's not captive by a gate or a portcullis. He's captive by his heart.
And as Chaucer would say, as he mocks that entire pretension, I'm hurt now through my nine into my heart, which of course is ridiculous, and Chaucer's making fun of it. But in this case, that is what happens to Yvain. And Lynette is going to help him achieve that goal. And so he can't return to Arthur's court because he's too much in love with Laudine, and he's stuck. But Lynette's going to help him.
You know, one of the things that I love about Chrétien is his description of what it feels like for this type of love. In Eric and Enid, which is a great poem, Eric, when he falls in love with Enid, they're aboard a ship, and he thinks he has seasickness.
Yes.
Because he's sick to his stomach.
And it's love sickness for a reason. Yeah. And with Eric and Enid, what's interesting about that is, again, this idea that you've got to balance your love with your knightly duties. Yes, and with your prowess and your reputation. Because a knight's reputation is as much about his courtesy, fidelity, piety,
as it is about his prowess.
As it is about his prowess. And in this instance, Lynette decides to help him win Laudine's hand by saying, oh, you need a knight now to defend your lands.
Yes, because of this environmental hazard in the land.
That's right. And we should just fence it off. But they're not.
Yeah, and Laudine is really aware of this. I mean, she's she's not only mourning the death of her beloved husband, she's mourning the death of the knight who protected the land. And you get the sense it's her land.
Yes. And because there's no question that she is in control, that she rules this land. And now that she's a widow, not unlike Marie de Champagne, if you think about it, now that she's a widow, she does not have a champion.
But she's going to have a champion.
She is. And Lynette brings Yvain to her and convinces her, look, the combat was honorable. This was not murder.
Therefore, Yvain is as good a knight, in fact, a better knight.
Because he defeated him.
Absolutely.
So it's, and then he declares his love for her, as you do. And, of course, as we're getting...
And she asked him great questions. Did you mean to dishonor me by doing this?
Absolutely not. No. I'm just totally in love with you. Because I'm in love with you. Because you're beautiful and you're distraught. And I just... sigh, take pity on me, please, which she does, and she decides that she loves him.
Yes.
Which is
great.
And what happens, of course, he takes up the position.
At this point, the corpse of Esclanos is not just bleeding, it's spinning.
It's probably rolling in his grave. But they do mention that the body's been cleared off at this point. Because they do, which is again back to that realism that Chrétien invokes. Because he says, okay, they carried the corpse away, they had their funeral, he's in the tomb.
Yes.
Moving on. And now, because he's been duly buried, Laudine is open to the possibility of a new champion.
The Seneschal is not happy about this new...
Because he had his own designs on her.
He has his own designs on her. But she chooses her husband.
And she has that right.
Yeah, and there's nothing they can do about it.
No, and what's interesting in this text is that the individual rights of women for inheritance, for property, for control and self-autonomy are a major facet.
They're major.
And this involvement of these knights in all of these domestic and economic affairs usually involve the economic rights of women.
Yes.
And they have them.
And it's reality.
It is reality. It's not the mystical, otherworldly sense of, these are the extraordinary women. This is everyday economic life. And the women are the ones who have the land. It's their inheritance. It's their position. It's their power, which is precisely Marie de Champagne.
Yes.
And precisely Eleanor of Aquitaine.
And the nice irony at this point is Arthur and his court are still coming.
Yes.
But the person who is now going to defend the well
is Yvain. And they don't know that because, of course, Yvain is in disguise.
Always.
You have to be.
There is a real reason for this incognito knight errant. And it's something I was thinking about because it appears in so many of the romances that they don't identify themselves. Part of the problem of the courtly society is how do you make a reputation for yourself without alienating all the other knights
who know you
and who will realize that if you rise up, they fall down. The thing that you always have to do is refrain from boasting. You have to always have this self-deprecation.
Humility.
Therefore, your actions will prove who you are and what you are, but you will never boast about them. You will wait for others to recognize it. And I think the knight incognito is part of this idea of the self-deprecatory motif that allows for this society of young men who are testosterone driven, who are probably horny as hell because they're in this court in which there just aren't available women except for maybe court prostitutes.
Right.
And who are competitive with each other, all thinking of themselves as warriors, all thinking in terms of honor and shame, and all of them armed.
And all of them needing a wife.
And so It's a tinderbox.
It is. And you end up with this tradition in a lot of medieval literature that focuses on the need for humility. And in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the 14th century, when Gawain initially says, "Oh, I am not worthy. I am the least of your knights. Let me take this challenge." Okay, nonsense. Everybody knows he is actually the best of Arthur's knight. Lancelot is an afterthought in that one reference. But eventually in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, he learns humility. He learns proper humility.
Proper humility.
Correct humility, real humility. But he also is taught the quality of restraint.
Yes.
Because the Green Knight gives him the kind of blow that Gawain should have started with. Gawain should have just nicked him on the neck and been done with it if he'd been clever and if he'd been interested in restraint. In this, in Yvain and the Knight with the Lion, restraint is also part of this. Because he does defeat the Escalados, he didn't necessarily need to kill him.
And he certainly didn't need to go headhunting.
And he didn't need to pursue him, and that becomes his moment of shame.
Yes.
And so the rest of the tale is about redeeming himself and learning the knightly quality of restraint and humility.
Which is why I see this as didactic. And one of the things that I think the Lord really approves of is teaching them mesure, teaching the young knights restraint.
And making
moderation.
Sure, well, partly because when you've got a lot of these young knights errant, as you just mentioned, all of these bachelor knights who are in pursuit of land, wealth, titles, because they're the younger sons. Yeah. They're out of the inheritance circuit with the primogeniture. So they're not going to necessarily inherit their own stuff. They need to get it for themselves. But that can lead to a lot of violence. That can lead to a lot of unmitigated violence. Add to that the dimensions of crusades and the sense of, well, we've got to go on a crusade and we have right on our side. We're going to learn these habits of warfare. This was a way of tempering that. This was a way of teaching them measured restraint, but also tempering the battle prowess and the need for valor on the battlefield and let's kill everything with... there are limits for that.
Yeah, and the limits are shown in tournaments. You're not supposed to kill your opponent in a tournament.
I mean, it happened, but that was...
But that's an accident.
That's an accident. It's not on purpose.
No, you take them prisoner. They ransom themselves off. They give you the horse. They give the armor. They may give you some money for it. But that's the point of it. It's that you've shown yourself to be superior. There's no need...
to kill them.
And part of the chivalric virtue is the virtue of mercy.
Yes. And when knights don't give mercy, that is always a mark against them. In Gawain's first adventure, as Mallory portrays in the Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, when he is sent to go after the white stag that comes rocketing through the hall. Okay, first of all, it's a bad idea when white animals come into your court.
Or white whales come alongside your ship.
Don't follow them. Just don't, because invariably they are otherworldly in some way. And the white dog that's pursuing the white stag that's then pursued by the knight, you have 3 knights that are sent off on these different adventures. One of them is Gawain, and he goes after the stag. And his hounds kill the stag. And another knight shows up and says, "You killed my stag. How dare you? That was so discourteous." And Gawain's like, "Oh yeah? Well, fight you for it." So what ensues is an actual duel between the two of them, one-on-one combat, and the knight is on the ground. Gawain has defeated him, and the knight is pleading for mercy. And a damsel comes out who, this is her love. The knight that Gawain is fighting is her love. The damsel comes out to also plead mercy. Gawain won't give it. And in a moment of rage, Gawain, our Gawain, goes to kill this knight who's been pleading for mercy, and he beheads the woman instead. And what happens is Gawain is like, "Oh, well, that's unfortunate." And he and his companions spend the night in the castle, which is not a good idea. But in the middle of the night, a bunch of ladies show up and beat the crap out of Gawain in punishment for this. And he is told that he must return to Arthur's court bearing the lady's head around his neck and her headless corpse on his horse. And when he gets back to Arthur's court, that leads to the Pentecostal oath that includes doing service to women and not killing them. But in Mallory, that's the end of a tradition, or the kind of culmination of a tradition where you have got to show mercy. And the fact that it's Gawain and Mallory is a whole nother topic for another day. But in this, the aspect of knightly mercy and courtesy and restraint is so important.
But I would remind the listeners that extends only to the noble classes.
That's true.
When it comes to peasants or clergy,
all bets are off.
Yeah, we're going to burn the village. We're going to,
yes. Yeah. And of course, with the clergy, I mean, it depends on whether there's a corrupt clergy or not. But
and also the rank of the clergy.
That's true as well. And you do get the sense that, sure, you want to instill mercy, you want to instill these values, and they might come into play in other scenarios. But the idea was to behave well among your peers.
Because they deserve mercy.
Yes. And you do have some criticism of that. Marie de France, in her lays, criticizes the hypocrisy of the court to a certain extent that is willing, in some ways, to take up this homosocial approbation.
The penalty for acting discourteously and being defeated, which happens always in the romances, is that the defeated knight is sent to Arthur's court to report his defeat, confess his misdeeds. So what the real penalty is the shame.
It's the humiliation.
Because shame is the other side of honor. And
the idea of your reputation, particularly in the 12th century, in the legal context, your fama, your publica fama was so important. It is your reputation.
Especially if you need oath helpers.
That's right.
You're not going to get an oath helper unless you have a good reputation. And
in a lot of cases, legal cases could not be brought against somebody of good reputation. But if somebody had a bad reputation or mala fama, there was every possibility that they could then be subject to trial where somebody who has good reputation could not. Yes. And that comes into play with interrogatory torture as well. But in these texts, that reputation, that honor is the defining feature of these knights, and Yvain has to earn it
Now he has, because he's now married. He's married to a wealthy widow.
Yes, and what has happened is that now he's taken up the role as her champion. And when Arthur and his knights show up,
what happens?
It's Kay. It is Kay.
I am so glad it's Kay.
It is, because Yvain trounces him.
He kicks his ass.
And he humiliates
knocks him off of his horse onto the ground. It's
glorious.
It's glorious.
In the original combat with Escalados, the point's made that they never knock each other off their horses. They're always on their horseback. That is a mark of good skill as a fighter. But Kay unseated, and that's humiliating. He's on the ground on his back, and he has been found wanting. He's been weighed, he's been measured, and he's been found wanting. And at this point, Arthur, they all are terribly amused by this.
Yeah.
But then they find out, they get the whole story, and Gawain is concerned.
He has to be, because Yvain is too content.
He's too happy with his marriage.
Yes, he loves Laudine.
And they spend a lot of time together. Now, it's not by accident that the story begins with Arthur and Guinevere having an afternoon shag.
Yeah.
And that's what leads to the whole thing. Same thing in Eric and Enid.
Love is fantastic, and love is essential for your honor and reputation to be worthy of the love of a beautiful woman. The problem is, if you get carried away with it, fat and lazy. I love the speech that Chrétien gives to Gawain. Quote, "What, would you be one of those men, said my lord Gawain to Yvain, who are worth less because of their wives? May he who diminishes his worth by marrying be shamed by Holy Mary. He who has a beautiful woman as wife, as sweetheart, should be the better for her. For it's not right for her to love him if his fame and worth are lost. Indeed, you would suffer afterwards for her love if it caused you to lose your reputation, because a woman will quickly withdraw her love, and she's not wrong to do so if she finds herself hating a man who has lost face in any way after he has become lord of the realm. A man should be concerned with his reputation before all else."
And that's what Gawain's worried about.
Yeah.
And Gawain is worried that Yvain is going to spend all of his time luxuriating with his wife. That's the same complaint that drives Eric and Enid's adventure in Chrétien's first one. And Gawain convinces Yvain, no,
Come with me on the tournament circuit.
And this way you can still keep up your knightly prowess and reputation.
And you'll be worthy. Because if you don't, you're going to lose her love because she's going to realize that you're no longer worthy of it.
And that's a very fine line. Because, of course, Laudine doesn't want her husband to go off and leave her.
No.
And she needs him. She needs him as her champion.
But she understands.
She does.
And there's a compromise to be had here.
There is. But, of course, Yvain has to keep that compromise. Now, Laudine says, you can go for a year.
1 year. Only 1 year.
Not even a year and a day.
1 year.
Because every other medieval romance, it's a year and a day.
And
here, it's a year.
Yeah.
I want you back.
And Yvain doesn't even want to go. I don't want to go, but I'll go.
And she gives him a ring as a token, and that's the promise. This promise has been made.
But going on a tournament circuit and partying with the guys, you lose track of time. I think we've all been there where you just sort of lost track of time.
You're having a wonderful time.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden that year
sweetie, I'll be home by 11. It's 1 o'clock. But I was having so much fun. I'm sorry.
I had a couple beers.
Yeah.
It's fine. Sorry
You know
about
how
that.
fast a year can go when you're on the tournament circuit?
Exactly. It's because you've got to get from tournament to tournament to tournament.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, he's late.
Yes. A year has passed, and Yvain and Gawain have set up a small court right outside of Chester, where King Arthur and his knights are staying, and Arthur has come to visit them when, to quote Chrétien, Yvain suddenly began to reflect. Since the moment he had taken leave of the lady, he had not been so distraught as now, for he knew for a fact that he had broken his word to her and stayed beyond the period set. With great difficulty, he held back his tears, but shame forced him to repress them. He was still downcast when they saw a damsel coming straight toward them, approaching rapidly on a dappled black palfrey. She dismounted before their tent without anyone helping her, and without anyone seeing to her horse, and as soon as she caught sight of the king, she let fall her mantle, and without it she entered the tent and approached the king. She said that her lady sent greetings to the king and my lord Gawain, and all the others except Yvain, that liar, that deceiver, that unfaithful cheat. For he had beguiled and deceived her. She had clearly seen through his guile, for he had pretended to be a true lover, but was a cheat, a seducer, and a thief. He realizes, God, I've really blown it, and it's so bad, he goes mad. He loses his mind because he loves her so much.
And this is something that also happens with Lancelot later on. He goes the hermit, he goes mad in the woods. But in this case, Yvain strips naked, as you do.
And runs into the woods. He becomes a wild man.
He's practically a werewolf, which is a Marie de France story.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he does meet a hermit because you need hermits.
You always do.
And the hermits are always retired knights who are now doing religious worship in the middle of nowhere in the forest. And what's wonderful is that you have, at this moment, which seems like completely fantastic, you have a moment of reality. Because what our wild man's doing is hunting, bringing animals to the hermit, who's then selling them at market so that they can eat.
So they have that economic exchange. And you don't have these magical sustenance. You don't have food that miraculously appears.
It's wonderful. Yeah, my problem with that whole scene is I keep on imagining Gene Hackman in Young Frankenstein.
I can see that. I can see that. I can completely see it. And I just think, of course, again of The Knight's Tale, where they're in the woods, and, of course, Chaucer, naked, walks through. What are you doing? I'm trudging. But at this moment, Yvain falls asleep in the woods, as you do, and he's recognized. Which
is amazing, because you're talking about a guy at this point who is scraggly beard, naked, and is a wild man, but he's recognized.
Yes, and this lady has a magical potion that is given to her it's an ointment that was concocted by Morgan the Wise, which is another interesting point, because this is Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister. And in Chrétien's tradition, she is wise. She's a healer. She is essentially a magician and sorceress of her own right, but for good.
For good.
And this lady has this ointment. She knows it will restore Yvain to his senses. However,
Don't use too much of it.
don't use too much of it, but of course, not only does she use too much of it, she uses all of it. She empties the box and she rubs him down with this ointment. And it says very specifically that she rubbed it so vigorously on his temples. Well, the effect of it is, sure, it restores his senses, but now he doesn't really fully remember why he was mad
To begin with, which is a good thing, actually.
Yes, I mean, he doesn't remember why he's naked. He doesn't remember why he's in the woods. But he kind of forgets what he did.
But, what's really interesting is why the lady is willing to use this really valuable ointment on him. She desperately needs a champion.
Again, we have a lady who has her own lands, but she has to have a champion to defend them, to go ahead and help her.
Yes. And just as Yvain's sanity has been returned to him, Chrétien brings his audience back to reality. The Lady of Norasan has ulterior motives in curing Yvain. Her town is under attack by Count Allier, whose men have pillaged and burnt her lands, which was the way that war was actually practiced in the 12th century. The restored Yvain, now bathed, shaved, and properly armored, leads the defenders from the town to intercept the invaders at a pass. The Lady of Norasan and the men and women who had remained in the town watched the combat from the battlement and praised the valor and prowess of Yvain, comparing him to a lion, very appropriate for this particular poem, who, provoked by hunger, feeds upon the fallow deer. Count Allier flees, but is caught by Yvain, who compels him to surrender and give his pledge and oath to the lady that he would hold peace with her from that day on, would make good all losses that she could prove, and that's a nice realistic touch right there, and rebuild the houses that his men had burnt. The lady, as so often happens in romances, offers herself to Yvain to be either his mistress or wife, but Yvain courteously asks for permission to leave, and she reluctantly grants it to him. Everywhere Yvain goes, the women that he encounters offer themselves to him.
Always. Absolutely.
And he keeps on turning it down. Cervantes made fun of this in Don Quixote, where Don Quixote, who is scrawny looking and his scarred face and he's missing teeth, nonetheless believes that every woman that he runs into is madly in love with him, and he must turn them down because he is faithful to Dulcinea, whom he's never actually met.
He then comes upon a lion being attacked by a dragon.
Yeah, and he knows that the lion is a wild beast, but he also knows that dragons are wicked and that lions are noble. And this lion is going to be killed by the dragon unless he does something, so he intervenes.
Yes, and what's interesting about that is because a lot of people assume that dragon slaying is a staple of medieval romance, and it actually is not. The fact that Yvain sees this dragon, knows that dragons are wicked and nasty and awful, suggests that Christian allegory of the dragon as a metaphor for Satan.
And the lion is a metaphor for Christ.
Exactly.
Which is why C.S. Lewis
uses his lion. But of course, you have a lot of different religious traditions that have a resurrecting God. So Christ, Aslan can be many other things as well. But the lion specifically as that noble animal, the symbol of royalty.
Which is the reason why we see lions lying at the feet of knights in effigies.
Which shows how loyal they are. Same reason you see dogs lying at the feet of effigies.
And often with women.
That's right.
Yeah, because of the loyalty of the dog.
That's right. And of course, because if you were noble enough, you might be able to keep dogs who were not just used for hunting, but also used for just pleasure and companionship.
Yeah, I miss my dog.
Aww.
Yeah. Dog died about a year ago, and I miss my dog.
I can understand that. I'm a cat person, and
I don't want to get a lion, though. I think that would be a bad idea.
I think it would be, too. I mean, I have cats, but I think a lion might be a little bit big for my sitting room,
yeah,
honestly.
I think so.
And in this case, though, Yvain's intervention saves the lion.
It saves the lion, and the lion is grateful.
Terribly so.
The lion actually does homage to him.
He does.
Quote, "The lion stood up upon its hind paws, bowed its head, joined its forepaws, and extended them towards Yvain in an act of total submission. Then it knelt down, and its whole face was bathed in tears of humility."
And he more or less pledges his loyalty by placing his paws. That actually evokes the whole process of knighthood and fidelity and making that oath of loyalty and fealty.
Boy, is that a good lion.
It is a very good lion. This lion now takes up his lap lion and follows him everywhere.
Yeah, and he doesn't have to order it. He doesn't have to tell it anything. It just goes with him. And it's going to protect him.
And it becomes his defining feature. Because now, Yvain can travel incognito, he can hide his identity, but he's now known as the Knight with the Lion.
The neat thing is that we now have a transformation in Yvain. Yvain, before his madness, was doing things in order to win individual glory and reputation. Now he's trying to basically restore his worthiness for Laudine.
Yes.
And he's doing it by selflessly serving women.
And he's selflessly serving women anonymously.
Anonymously, incognito.
Right, and because he's doing it anonymously, he does not get any fame or reputation for himself.
Instead, it's for the Knight with the Lion.
And it is for the honor of the ladies that he defends. And what happens is he just goes about defending all of these noble women, and finally he ends up defending a woman who's a kinswoman of Gawain.
Yes, and she's in real trouble because she's been under siege by a giant, literally a giant.
Yes.
We're not talking metaphorically, a giant.
Yes.
And that's a nasty piece of work, this giant. And this giant is not only going to take her castle, but the giant is going to rape her and then give her over to his kitchen. The giant has a kitchen staff.
As you do.
Apparently. And she needs desperately a champion. He doesn't know yet that she is kinswoman to Gawain. And he also has a problem because he's been asked at this point to do something which is essential. Lunete has been accused of treason.
For having aided him.
And she needs a champion
to defend her in combat.
Because she's going to be burnt at the stake otherwise.
That's right. And she says this, she's been accused of treason. She will either be burned or hanged. She needs somebody to ride as her legal champion in a trial by combat.
And Yvain has to be at that trial, has to be at the court at the exact right time. Or else
she's going to be executed. Because he will have defaulted and she will have no champion.
So he has this problem. His host, a beautiful young woman, is going to be defiled at dawn, and he has to be at his old court by the end of that day.
But he manages it.
He does.
And he fights the giant. And now the whole combat with the giant is reminiscent of the giant of Mont Saint-Michel that you get in Geoffrey of Monmouth and the other traditions that then evolve much later into the alliterative Morte d'Arthur. And that's a nasty giant. I mean, giants in medieval literature are not nice.
No, they're not nice. They're not Andre the Giant.
No. And in fact, the idea of a giant who's going to rape a woman in the Giant of Mont Saint-Michel, he actually rapes the Duchess to death. And it is Arthur who finds this out and then kills the giant by castrating him, but also disemboweling him, as you do.
As you do.
And in this instance, though, Yvain, he's caught, but he's going to do both. He's going to manage it. And he does. Which is really impressive. But when he comes to save Lunete, what he discovers is, to do it, he has to fight not only the Seneschal, but the Seneschal's son
as well.
Yes, and this does not say very much for those Seneschals.
No, it really doesn't.
And the Seneschals are absolutely paramount to the running of estates.
And this is the point that from earlier about Kay. Making fun of a Seneschal is like making fun of a vice principal in a high school. These are the people who are going to make your life miserable if you screw up. And the Seneschal is also the gatekeeper for the lord and the lady. You can't get to the lord or the lady except going through the Seneschal. For a young knight, the Seneschal stands in his way. The Seneschal is responsible for his training. The Seneschal is a bad guy. And one of the ways of winning favor with your audience is by making fun
of the seneschal.
of the seneschal.
Which is why it's so ironic that that Guinevere has such harsh words for Kay at the beginning of the text, because Guinevere just rips Kay a new one, and it is Yvain who defends him. Because before all of this starts, Guinevere is ripping into Kay, and Yvain says, no, Kay is honorable, Kay is good, Kay is he's none of those
He's
things.
none of that.
None of those things.
And Laudin's seneschal and the seneschal's son are not honorable either. They're not doing this because they believe that Lynette was treasonous. They're doing it because the seneschal wants his son to marry the lady.
He wants the goods. He wants the land. He wants that title. And so they have concocted this whole plot, and they've used the legal framework of treason to do so.
And of course, they don't want to fight the lion, and so the lion has to be locked up.
Yes.
But this becomes a motif. The lion, by locking up the lion, it takes the responsibility away from Yvain if the lion helps.
Right.
And the lion always is going to figure out how to get out of its box.
And come help.
And
in fact, with the giant, the lion helps immensely, ripping chunks off of the giant.
It's nice to have a lion as your pet.
It is, but you still want to make sure that the knight gets some of the credit, or gets a lot of the credit for his own prowess.
And so Yvain saves Lynette and doesn't reveal himself. He's simply the knight with the lion. So Laudine doesn't know that knight was her husband.
And it's important that they are still married despite all of this, because that will come up later in the text. And, as Yvain is rescuing all these noblewomen, and then he rescues the noblewomen who are imprisoned by demons, who are forcing them into a sweatshop labor exchange.
But that brings us to one of my favorite incidents in this entire poem, the sweatshop.
Yes.
Yvain is now traveling, and Yvain comes across a castle, and he's told, don't go in. You're only going to find shame in there. Stay away. Keep going. And Yvain sort of ignores it, and he goes into the castle, and he discovers something really weird. There are about 300 damsels, and they're all working busily embroidering textile. They're doing silk work, in fact. And he looks at them, and he knows they're noblewomen, and their shifts are dirty and ragged, worn out at the breast and at the elbows, and they are very, very thin. It's clear that they haven't had any new clothes, and they just don't have enough to eat. And he asks, what's going on here? And they won't tell him. He finally gets somebody to tell him, and says, well, you have to understand that this is the work of these two demon sons. No, I mean this literally. They're not just bad guys.
No, they're demons.
They're
actual demons.
Their mothers are human, but their father was a devil. And they're black, and they're wicked. And what they have done is they took prisoner the Lord of the Isle of Maidens. I can't believe there's an Isle of Maidens.
Of course there is.
And in order for him to be released and his life spared, he makes a pledge that he has to send 30 damsels every year, which means that this has been going on for 10 years, because there's 300 of them.
That's right.
Working their way. And what he discovers from one of them is how wretched it is. They're being given to live on 4 pennies, 4 deniers to live on, which is not enough even to have enough food.
Right.
And yet each one of them is producing 20 sous worth of textiles, which I love, every week. And you're thinking to myself, these demons are selling the textiles at market?
And then we get the same kind of economic transaction as Yvain bringing the animals to the herd.
Yes. All of a sudden we're in the real world, but now with the sons of a demon.
And what's interesting, of course, because noblewomen are trained in embroidery, and one of their skills and their marketable skills is their ability to produce beautiful textiles.
And it's being sold.
Right. And they're being forced.
Now, the really, really weird thing is that these sons of the devil, which is what they call the sons of the devil, are actually in the service of a lord of the castle who has, strangely enough, an unmarried and incredibly beautiful daughter.
Always. And
Barely 16.
Barely 16, who has all of these huge tracts of land.
Yes.
She is well landed, as it were.
And the Lord is courteous, and he knows that Yvain is a really noble knight. And he says to him, my daughter will take care of you. And she shows him all the courtesy. And then in the morning, he discovers he's not allowed to leave.
Right. And of course, he's not allowed to leave because
there's a custom.
There is.
He must fight.
The Demon Brothers.
If he defeats them and kills them,
he gets to marry her.
And
that seems to be the prize at every turn, because you have a young, marriageable, eligible, intelligent, witty woman, because her father describes her that way.
Yes.
It focuses on her intellect and her huge tracts of land. But Yvain can't marry her.
No, and he has to fight the devil's sons.
Anyway.
And he does. But I love it. They tell him, the custom is that you have to fight us. And you can't use that lion because then it would be 2 against 2. Right. And that wouldn't be fair.
No, because it's not fair for you to use a lion, but we'll fight you together.
And Yvain says, okay, take my lion away. No, I'm not going to touch your lion. You do it. Where do you want me to put him? I'll put him into that storage room.
Right. And of course the lion will get out.
Because the lion hears the fight going on.
And wants
the lion has to. And he goes madly digging, breaks out, and saves Yvain's ass once again. Jumps upon one of those brothers, brings him to the ground, rips his arm off, I think.
I believe, yeah. And then rips chunks off of him as well.
And the other demon son turns around to help his brother, which gives Yvain the chance to chop his head off.
As you do, because you've got to cut the heads off. You've got to cut the heads off.
But he spares the
other one.
The other one who's lying on the ground.
Who's been mauled by the lion.
And he says, do you give up? Yes, I do. And he spares him.
Because there's that quality of mercy. And
even against the son of the devil.
Absolutely. And that quality of mercy when you fought a combat, and if that combat is honorable, then you give mercy when it's asked.
Absolutely. But the lord of the castle now wants the prize to be given.
And it's a prize for him too. A noble son-in-law is a prize for him as much as anything.
Yeah.
And he keeps trying to foist his daughter on Yvain, who keeps saying, I can't
do this. I'm sorry. She's lovely. In fact, he says she would be worthy for the Emperor of Germany.
Right. But in this case, Yvain, since he's incognito, he can't tell them he's married already. And, of course, he has no interest in putting aside Ladine for any other woman. He wants to get back to her. All of this is eventually in the hope that he will be reunited with his wife. But you have this father who's like, why? Why don't you want to marry my daughter?
I can't tell you, but I gotta go.
I'm out of here. And then he finally does.
Well, he meets now another lady.
Yes.
A younger sister who's having an inheritance. And this is, again, we are in reality now.
Yes.
Because this is a legal dispute over inheritance.
Yes.
2 daughters, elder, younger, and the elder is claiming the entire inheritance, and the younger sister is saying, no, Dad left us portable inheritance.
Right. And I mean, as somebody who's been dealing with inheritance myself for the last year from my father's death with my older sister, I can sympathize. My sister, however, has behaved exceptionally well. And
you don't need Yvain then.
I don't need Yvain, but I can understand how that could devolve. And that's what happens. And this devolves into an actual legal dispute about the right of inheritance.
Yes.
And what's interesting about it is, again, these are 2 women. Nobody's contesting the right of the women to inherit, but they're contesting the right of the older sister to dispossess her younger sister.
And it's going to be determined by a trial by combat.
And of course, the women themselves cannot fight, and so they need champions.
The champion of the older sister is going to be Gawain.
Yes.
And our hero discovers, as they're beginning to fight, who his opponent is.
And he doesn't want to hurt him.
Yeah, and this is the really weird thing, because again, you have a conflict of duties. On the one hand, Yvain has agreed to defend the right of the younger sister. So if Yvain concedes, he's conceding
that she has no claim.
That she has no claim.
Yes.
But he doesn't want to fight Gawain.
And Gawain is struck by this knight's honor and doesn't really want to hurt him either. And eventually, when their identities are revealed, because Yvain asks Gawain's
They both
name,
want to concede to the other.
right, and they're kind of dancing around each other, trying not to hurt them.
And thank God Arthur is there, and Arthur figures it out. Instead of a trial by combat, we will do this with the royal way. I will look at the rights, and I'll make a decision, and the younger sister gets her portion.
And the way that happens is also very striking, because Arthur questions the older sister. He says, "Are you the older sister who dispossessed unjustly her younger sister and tried to take her inheritance by force?" And the older sister says, "I am here, my lord."
Yeah.
And Arthur says, "Oh, you're here, are you? Because that means you've just admitted to taking her inheritance unjustly and disinheriting her." And the older sister goes, "Wait, what? I didn't mean to say anything that would, foolishly make a claim. You tricked me." And Arthur says, "That's life. And I am going to serve justice here. You will restore your sister's rights of inheritance." And he makes her swear an oath to do so right there and give her that inheritance at that moment.
And so what you have is royal justice being done. And it shows that Arthur is not just simply the chivalrous king, he is also a just king.
And that's an important facet, particularly as Arthur's character evolves in other romances, is this adherence to justice. And in so many of the English romances of the 14th century, Gawain is the just one. Arthur sometimes his justice is a little fuzzy, and when it gets to the adultery trials with...
Yeah, he doesn't want justice.
He really doesn't want to even deal with it.
Because the law there is going to mean that he has to do something, and he would prefer not to do anything.
Right, because in those instances, Guinevere's adultery is treason, and he has to do something if he admits that he knows about it, and he doesn't want to know about it.
No, he doesn't want to know about it.
He really doesn't.
He wants to be a clueless cuckold.
Absolutely, because he'd rather have Lancelot in his armory.
And we will talk about that in an episode on Lancelot and Tristan.
And we will do that.
Well, we're running out of time, so it's a good thing that we're coming to the end of the poem. When Yvain recovers from the wounds he suffered in the aborted trial by combat, he comes to the realization that he cannot endure life any longer unless the love of his life takes pity on him and forgives him. The poem is going to conclude pretty much where it began. Yvain returns to the magical well, pours water on the stone table, and the storm that follows is so violent that the tower of Laudin's castle sways and is on the verge of collapsing. To their and her shame, none of Laudin's knights are willing to ride out to defend the spring. Lunete, who apparently knows that Yvain is the knight who has caused the storm, now does her final and greatest service to him. She tricks her lady into forgiving him. She does this by pointing out that Laudin needs a great champion, and the perfect knight for that would be the knight with the lion. But that knight is dying of sadness, she tells Laudin. He's dying of sadness and grief because of the enmity that his lady feels toward him. If Laudin wants the service of the knight with the lion, she will have to help him reconcile with his lady. Laudin, not knowing the identity of the knight with the lion, responds by pledging that if the knight with the lion comes to her rescue, she would do everything in her power without guile or deception to reconcile them. I love the reference to guile and deception here, as Lunete is in the process of deceiving her lady, though she's doing it for the very best motives. As Chrétien puts it, Lunete is about to, quote, very courteously catch her lady in the game of truth, end quote. Lunete now has a precious reliquary brought out so that Laudin can swear an oath upon it.
And Lunette's very careful in the wording that she chooses, and she gets Laudin to swear an oath that she will champion this knight and help him in any way that she can, no matter what.
And at that point, the knight with the lion reveals his real identity.
And Laudin's actually pretty put off by this. She's annoyed. She's like, hey.
Yeah, you tricked me.
And how dare you? Because he has no regard for me. Because she still thinks that he has had no regard for her, that he doesn't really love her, and that, now she's been forced to honor an oath to somebody she thinks doesn't love her.
But she secretly is happy about it.
Of course she is. Because when he reveals himself and she finds this out and she protests, she's protesting, he says, no. I love you so much.
And also he has one reputation and honor, not as Yvain, but as the knight with the lion. And she is now restored not only to her former husband, who was a good enough knight. Yeah. Good enough. But now he is a great knight. He is a champion who is the equal of Gawain.
And not only that, their love can now stand. And their marriage is solid, and his value and his worth meets hers.
It's a wonderful poem. I mean, I really enjoy it, but it's a medieval poem. And you have to have patience if you're reading it, because it is not linear.
And there's a lot to it.
It's long.
It is long. And a lot of Chrétien stories are long. But really, Chrétien's interest in justice and equality and balance and restraint are important for the way that we understand medieval culture itself. Because we have a lot of modern misconceptions. And Chrétien shows us so much of his own reality, from the economics to the interest in medicine, the constant references to surgeons and physicians, and the reality of medieval life was not cut and dry.
It's really a wonderful poem because it works if you're teaching medieval literature or if you're teaching medieval history.
And it's also just an interesting case study in so many aspects of medieval life for scholars, or just for people who are interested in saying, I want to know more about the medieval world. Read Chrétien, because he's going to give you all of that.
And what you have to do is get rid of your preconceptions of what should happen.
Yes.
When I first read this, and I was teaching this in class, I thought to myself, how would this be portrayed if this were a modern American movie? In a John Hughes-type rom-com of the 1980s, by the end of the film, Yvain would realize that the woman that he truly loves is Lunette, who has been in love with him from the very beginning and who has been selflessly helping him win the love of a woman who doesn't really deserve him.
As a Gen Xer, I can totally relate to that because, you think about The Breakfast Club, also John Hughes. You think about Some Kind of Wonderful, which is exactly that plot line, where you've got Eric Stoltz, who's mad for the hot, beautiful woman, and he's being helped out by Jennifer Jason Leigh, who's nerdy, and, she's kind of rough around the edges, and she's best
tomboyish.
Friend. Exactly. And she's helping him win the lady love. Well, eventually he gets the lady love, but the lady love realizes, you know what? I actually think you two are better suited. And she gives over.
Yes.
And he
realizes
that she's been his best friend all the time, and he turns to her.
And that she's really beautiful.
And that she has been telling him everything that he needs to know about love because she's in love with him.
In our Hollywood version of Yvain, at the end of it, he would realize that Laudine, who's been treating him miserably, doesn't really love him. And that the one who really loves him is Lynette.
And that he should turn to Lynette, sweep her in his arms, and snub the socks off of her.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen.
And it
because
doesn't
it's
happen.
Medieval.
Exactly. And how it ends is that Laudine and Yvain have a wonderful, happily ever after, and Lynette is just happy that Yvain is happy.
Yes, and she gets to flirt with Gawain.
Absolutely. And we would hope that maybe perhaps Gawain should turn his preference to Lynette, because Gawain...
Yeah, but we know Gawain. Gawain's not going to marry her. No. He may turn his preference to her, but he's not going to marry her.
That's true. And at least she doesn't fall for Lancelot.
That's true. I think with that, we come to the end of this episode. I can't tell you how happy I am that you joined us for this.
It was my pleasure, and it was a delight, and I cannot wait to have longer conversations and more conversations about Lancelot and Tristan.
I think that'll be great, and I also want to do one on just cruelty and torture.
Because torture and brutality is my bag.
That is your bag? Okay. Thank you, Kat. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for inviting me. That was fun.
It really was. Well, we've come to the end of another episode. Until next time, bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.